Alright, hello everyone. Today we are going to be doing an intro to psychology lecture. I'm very excited to share this with you guys, and I'm glad that everybody came. Alright, let's do it. Okay, so first of all, we have to talk about the scope of the presentation because obviously psychology is a huge field. It's existed for quite some time, and there are a lot of subfields. I'm going to go over that as well. So it's not really possible to even give a good intro to psych. If you are actually taking a bachelor's, like you're undergoing a bachelor's degree, you're trying to get one in psychology, you would have an intro course that would last months, right? So how much can we do in one lecture? Not that much, but we can do something for sure. And so I do want to have people keep in mind that literally people who specialize in psychology, they will take one topic, one small part of the brain, one small aspect of human social life, and that will be their specialization that they will go so deep into and learn every nook and cranny of. So there's a lot to learn, but I think that if you understand that, and if you can start to get the full picture of the complexity, then that will allow you to know where to look if you want to learn more. And also, it will give you a way to kind of consider all sides of an issue. So for instance, for me, I have studied psychology both academically and on my own, but obviously I don't know everything. But if I start to consider a psychological topic, I can kind of take a pause and think, what are all the different facets of this that might be there? And actually, if you start getting into a science, you can start to have really good instincts for, I bet there's already research in this area. I would hypothesize they might have found this. And then you can start to look for what you're looking for and find out more information. So basically, the goal of this lecture is to give you guys that overview and the mental scaffolding to understand what even is being studied in psychology and what the study of psychology can give to you. So that's my goal. And we're going to start, we're going to start with this slide and then we're going to get to my first section. Okay, so psychology definitely overlaps with a lot of different fields. So it would make sense to say biology and chemistry, right? So you're studying brain chemistry, you're studying the way that the body works physically. That's a big part of psychology as well. So I was coming up with different examples for each of these, and I think that a crossover study between psychology and biology would be to study the galvanic skin response. So your skin is a very complicated organ, and it sends electrical signals across it, which can be measured. So you could measure the galvanic skin response, and that would kind of be an overlap, and it would be even more of an overlap between biology and psychology if you were to then ask the people you were studying, could you feel those signals? And then when you were, let's say you measure it and you find that this person is having a really high galvanic skin response, you could ask them what their emotional state was at that time, what they were experiencing, things like that. That's one example of how psychology and biology overlap. Then sociology, there's a big overlap there. So I thought one example, because sociology is more broad and is looking more at institutions rather than individuals as opposed to psychology, I thought one example of a crossover concept there would be of the stereotype threat. So that's this idea that minorities, there's stereotypes about people, right? And so if you were to kind of prime somebody, that's another psychology concept, if you were to introduce that stereotype into a situation, they're more likely to fall into the stereotype. So I have two examples of real studies that did this. So one would be a case where they did a study where they had women play chess against a computer. And in the whole study, the women were playing against a computer, but half of the women were told that they were playing a computer, and the other half were told they were playing against men. And the women who thought they were playing against men performed significantly worse. And they did this, they also kept it consistent where women would be told 1 minute they're being played a computer. Like, they found worse performance in the same women being told that they're playing against a man. And then another interesting one is a case where they had black and white students, athletes, I believe, take a test, and they changed nothing about the test except the title. In one case, they told the students it was a test of athletic ability, and then in the other case, they told them it was a test of athletic intelligence. And when they said it was ability, the black students performed better, and the white students performed way worse. And if it was supposed to be intelligence, the black students performed worse, and the white students performed better. So just the introduction of stereotypes and beliefs that people have about who they are and how they relate to others in society can affect things, regardless of who they really are as a person, basically. And then there would be a big overlap with another social science, anthropology. So anthropology is like the study of human culture. I thought of one example of this that I found interesting is like, basically people, depending on their cultural background, might interpret a thing that happens very differently, especially things that are considered supernatural. And I have one example that I learned about years ago. There was a UFO sighting in rural Zimbabwe at this place called the Ariel School in the 90s. And the white students who had access to TV at home thought that they had seen a UFO. But the black students who were more rural and less likely to have TV interpreted it as part of their folklore and that they had seen some kind of like demons or supernatural entities. So that's obviously a kind of extreme and difficult to explain case in the first place, but just their cultural background created how they interpreted that event. So, but at the end of the day, you really can approach almost anything through psychology because psychology is like the study of humans and how they work. So I think it's really useful in personal life. If you wanted to, you can study the psychology of music. You can study all sorts of different things, and I'll be talking about that later when I go over specializations. Okay, but before we get there, we're going to talk about the history of psychology. I wanted to give this background information here because I think that if you look up history of psychology, you're going to start seeing things like 1800s, Europe, America, Western, and I think that psychology kind of goes back further than that. I think that people have always been interested in these topics, and so a lot of this is true in a lot of different domains. So there have been really ancient attempts to understand the human beings, basically, both philosophically and physically. So here, this picture I have on the screen is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which is a really, really ancient text from Egypt. So it has a pretty not fully accurate, it's missing some stuff and whatever, but it has one of the first known, or maybe the first known attempt of human beings to describe the brain and different regions of the brain. And so this is from 1600 BC. So very long time ago. People have been working on this for a long time. It also has a lot of other medical, they were already diagnosing people with things. So that's an example of early medicine. And then medieval Islam was already starting to develop psychiatry. And I mean, people always knew that there was such a thing as madness. I think that people could observe that, and they had different ways of understanding that through religion or whatnot. And I think that a lot of different cultures had started to figure out that there could be physical causes for mental distress, but in medieval Islam, they were actually starting to come up with diagnoses and also treatment. So very like humane places where people could go for asylum. And then definitely philosophy and religion, I think, has its own implications for psychology, that people were pursuing psychology, maybe not in ways that we would now consider scientific, but in ways that actually are quite interesting to this day. The Greeks were coming up with all sorts of interesting ideas and ways of thinking about things and really analyzing the mind itself. Confucius was one of the first people to come up with descriptions of how human beings develop. So like developmental stages, that's a very early example. And then Hinduism and Buddhism both have, I think, their own ways of approaching psychology and also practices for mental well-being in these traditions, I think. So I just wanted to kind of broaden the scope there for ways of thinking about psychology. And some specific examples would be like the ship of Theseus from the Greeks. And so it's this idea that if there's a ship, Theseus is sailing it around the world, and every island he lands on, he has to replace a plank. And eventually he replaces the entire ship, every single piece of wood. Is it still the same ship? You could say that's a philosophical question about material, but you could also say that that's a question about how do human beings define things? How do we think about things? And that brings in this psychology concept of psychic continuity. So how come human beings think even something which goes through a massive transformation is still the same entity? That seems to be a property of our ability to think. And then we have Liu Xie, who was a ancient Chinese philosopher and monk, and he was actually coming up with psychology experiments all the way back in the day. I believe that that's 6th century BC. I might be incorrect about that, but that's my recollection. And so he was doing attention experiments. So for example, having people try to draw, like, let's say a square with one hand and a circle with the other, and finding that that was very difficult for people to do. So he's finding attention is still a major thing being studied in psychology, and he was finding that it's difficult, right? It's difficult to, like, he was basically finding a limit to human attentional capabilities. And then another example would be the Book of Optics. This is also from medieval Islam. It was written by Ibn al-Haytham. So this is a book that was studying the vision system, which is also something that psychology covers. And specifically, what he was coming up with theories which are still considered, true, like we see through light entering the eye, basically. So very early on, people were already figuring out a lot of things and coming up with their own theories and ways of studying things. I would say that that particular example of the Book of Optics is quite scientific. So, yeah. So then we're going to talk about physiology. So pretty early on in science, people were figuring certain things out about how the body works. If you're looking into medicine and the history of medicine, there's a lot there with when dissection sort of became something that you were allowed to do. And so in 1780, you have Luigi Galvani doing electricity experiments where he was basically zapping dead frogs with electricity and seeing that they twitched. So that's when people were starting to figure out that electricity had something to do with the body working and moving. And then 1800s, we have our German fella here, Hermann von Helmholtz. So he was actually starting to do like serious scientific experiments where he was measuring how fast neurons communicate, which is pretty cool. And of course, this area has still, is still being studied and is very complicated. But even back then, people were starting to figure things out. And a lot of the early on things that people were doing in psychology, I would say that they often did have to do with sensation and perception, because I feel like that's something kind of easier to measure generally. So that was one of the things that he was up to. But also we have some instances of localization that were being uncovered. So localization is the idea that different regions of the brain do different things. Now, this is kind of I don't know if I want to say it's a contested area. I would just say the brain is extremely complicated, so it's not as easy as saying this part of the brain does this one singular thing and no other part of the brain does that. That's not how it works. It's way too complicated for that. But at the same time, localization is a fact. There are different parts of the brain which are kind of dedicated to different things. So we have the famous case of Phineas Gage, who was a railroad worker who had a stake go through his brain, and it knocked out a lot of his frontal lobe. And so that affected his personality and his impulse control and things like that. So it was like people realized, oh, this guy's still walking around, he's still alive, but damage to his brain changed things about who he was. And there's also other early cases that were being discovered were aspects of aphasia, so basically damage to the brain's damage to the brain's speech centers. So we have Broca and Wernicke's areas. So in the case, these are regions of the brain, and in the case where there's damage to the Broca's area, usually what happens, it can be complicated, but usually what happens is the person can still understand speech, and they are going to try to produce their own speech, but they can't. So damage to the Broca's area usually does not affect speech comprehension, it affects speech production. And then Wernicke's area is more of a case where the person can produce speech, they can speak, but their speech no longer has meaning. Their words are still real words. They come out, but they're word salad, which is a term in psychology that's also used to apply to schizophrenia, because that can be seen in schizophrenia. Like, even the sentences and words can even be grammatical, but they don't mean anything, which obviously is very distressing for people who have these conditions. And it's just another way that people were starting to uncover, oh, parts of the brain seem to do specific things. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. I just wanted to mention these developments in psychology. So basically, early on, a lot of the people we've already talked about so far were associated with structuralism. So they were trying to find kind of what is the brain made of, or what is thought made of, if that makes sense. They were trying to figure out what is the smallest component of thought, kind of. And then people came along later and were like, that's the wrong question to ask. You have to look at the brain as a whole. How does it work? So functionalism is more, how does it work? And Gestalt would be associated with kind of holism. So trying to look at how does a thing function in its whole. And Gestalt is often associated with sensation and perception, so we'll be seeing that again later. Okay, so William James was an American psychologist, pretty famous, contemporary of Freud, and he was doing his own thing at the time. He was an empiricist, so he really believed that information comes from sensory experience. He was also a pragmatist. He was kind of a philosopher, so he wrote in a lot of different areas, but him being a pragmatist basically means that he thought that truth was basically a matter of expedience, so whatever is useful to a person could be considered truth under that understanding. And he was the person who coined the term stream of consciousness. So I put, you cannot go down to the same river twice, because he thought that basically the mind is never the same from moment to moment, which we now know is true based on neuroscience. So you can have similar experiences, but you will never have the same experience. He's associated with this James Lange theory. Other people contributed to this understanding, but basically it's a theory of emotion, which says that basically physiology comes first. So the reason that you feel fear is because your physical system is designed to. So if you, like, the classic example is if you see a bear, the immediate physical response is elevated heart rate, adrenaline, get out of there. And your fear is just the result of that. This theory's been contested, but it's kind of an interesting way of understanding how emotion works. Or I think it could be argued with, but I also think we would not have emotions if not for our physiological body. So he kind of supported the idea of instincts along with Freud. So both he and Freud were kind of opposing a common understanding at the time, which was that human beings have less instincts than animals, and they actually argued that human beings have more instincts than animals. He was a proponent of free will, and he believed that attention was important to free will. So basically, your ability to focus your attention on different things is the crux of your free will, basically. And then he also studied religious experience. So he thought that religious experience was ineffable, as in it can't be described to others. It's a very intense and personal thing, and you can't ever really put it into words. Then noetic quality means you feel like you've had gnosis, you've been given some kind of knowledge. And then it's transience, it's only in one moment, and you're passive in it. It happens to you. And he thought that this could happen regardless of religious tradition or background. It happened the same or equally in all religions. Okay, so now we get into the Big Papa himself, Mr. Freud. So I wanted to try to give both his, or Freudian psychology's, contributions and drawbacks. So that's how I've organized this. So I think psychoanalysis as an approach brings a lot to the table. It's a way of thinking that you have to learn, but I think it is worth learning. I'm going to get to this later, but he also gave us the idea of developmental stages. As I already mentioned, we have instincts and drives. So Freud believed in the erotic drive, which is like the life drive, kind of. So it's like not just about sex, it's also about eating. It's also about anything that's creative, that part of ourselves, but also that we have a drive towards death, which is seen in destructiveness and things like that. Defense mechanisms come from Freudian psychology. So if you ever hear anybody talking about denial, projection, splitting, any of these things originate in Freudian psychology and psychoanalysis. Actually, his daughter, Anna Freud, was the one who kind of systematized a lot of these things. Freud focused on childhood. I think that he is the reason that, maybe not the reason, but he kind of originated, perhaps, a lot of modern understanding that early childhood experiences are very important. It was not as commonly talked about before him, and the same with understanding of family. He also analyzed society in some interesting ways and kind of connected these other elements that he was talking about to society itself. And if you, for instance, think about his concept of id, ego, and superego, which I'm not a particularly big fan of, but the superego is the part of ourselves which is socialized by society. So it's like an internalization of authority, basically. He also believed that dreams were important and brought us dream analysis. I mean, people had done it before him, but he brought kind of a new way of doing it. And I also just wanted to mention it with psychoanalysis, it has a very embodied focus. So it's focusing on the physical body in many ways. I think that when people hear psychoanalysis, they think it's this very cold mental thing, but I actually think for me, it's been something which is it makes you very aware of yourself and your own bodily functions, which we normally avoid talking about or thinking about. So Freud thought that we have a civilizing society which encourages us not to think of ourselves as animals and talk about our bodily functions. But if you get more into Freudian psychology, you start to kind of understand how we're affected by that, basically. And then, of course, Freud didn't just drop his stuff and then nobody ever thought about it again, and we only have his ideas. Lots of other people have continued to elaborate on Freud. So, a major follower of Freud was Jung, who went off and did his completely own thing, which is actually no longer considered psychoanalysis, it's something else. And it's more focused on kind of spiritual or almost global, like the idea of the collective consciousness, right? And then we have people like Frantz Fanon, who applied Freudian concepts or psychoanalysis to an understanding of colonialism and the unconscious motives of both the colonizers and the colonized. So you definitely can do pretty much whatever you want with it. And of course, since day one, Freud has had followers who got a lot out of his work but violently disagreed with him on various issues. But drawbacks, Freud specifically was really based in 19th and 20th century Europe. He was looking at rich people. He was looking at, his clients were generally wealthy. And his ideas really don't make, I don't want to say they don't make sense out of that concept, but they're very specific to that concept. I've read his book Civilization and Its Discontents, and he tries to describe what he thinks happened in like prehistory, and he really just projects what he was seeing around him onto the past in some pretty spectacular ways. Of course, Freud has been criticized for basically early in his career, he was supporting this idea of there being widespread sexual abuse because he was hearing that from his clients, and then later on he kind of switched up and said that that was all just fantasy on the part of patients. And there's a lot of politics there, and it would take a lot of time to get into, but it's definitely sketchy that even happened. Also, psychoanalysis historically, in terms of working with clients, basically completely discounts patients because they're considered to be not trustworthy. It's the job of the psychoanalyst to find out what's really going on, so somebody's conscious understanding basically doesn't matter. I don't know if I would really consider psychoanalysis to be scientific. Freud wanted to be seen as scientific, but I would actually put psychoanalysis more in the realm of the humanities, personally. And then I put this in bold here. Shapes received understanding of psychology to a significant degree for better or worse. I said shapes because when I took Intro to Psychology and we talked about the history of psychology and we got to Freud, they immediately started with Freud did some stuff, but nobody really believes what he says anymore, and it's not important, so we're not going to go into it. Here's like a couple bullet points, and then we're moving on. But people can say, oh, he's been debunked, blah, blah, blah. But I would say how people see themselves and see psychology in a general way has been very shaped by psychoanalysis and by Freud. So just the fact that people talk about the unconscious, right? Like having an unconscious mind, that comes from Freud. So then what does that mean, right? On the one hand, I think it's been good that, for instance, we now know that childhood experiences are important, that people can be doing something for motives they're not aware of. But then at the same time, the second that people believe that they have an unconscious, it kind of changes them. People have become more, they have more metacognition, which is a term from psychology of like thinking about thinking. So it's like, on the one hand, he was describing things which existed before he described them, but then once he described them, he sort of made people the way he described them, if that makes sense. And then I wanted to end here by talking about his nephew, Edward Bernays, who married his daughter Anna Freud, because good old Bernays brought Freud's ideas over here to America, and then he decided to apply them to PR and government campaigns and advertising to get people to smoke more cigarettes, to go to war, by manipulating people. So Freud discovered this stuff. I believe just the fact that these applications worked kind of validates Freudian psychology, but that's not the best thing to have happened. So I just wanted to bring up all of these the caveats to Freudian psychology. Okay, so the three forces. We already talked psychoanalysis, but psychoanalysis became very dominant, especially in the area of therapy and working with clients. But that's not to say that that was the only thing going on in psychology. So especially in like I would say started around the 30s and then ramped up into the 50s, behaviorism really started to take over. So this is the study of behavior. Behaviorists typically said there's no point in studying cognition. There's no point in studying anything you can't measure and see. So behaviorists are associated particularly with like trying to change behavior through conditioning. So two of the most major concepts or like major ways of doing that are operant and classical conditioning. I said them in the wrong order because I'm going to start with classical. Classical conditioning is just the basic Pavlov's dog type thing. So basically, one thing gets associated with another. This could happen through purposeful conditioning. Somebody could condition themselves or be conditioned, or it could just happen naturally. So I saw a video recently where somebody was talking about how the second they get in the bathroom, they have to go real bad. Well, that's because they've built an association in their mind between needing to go and being in the bathroom. So that's classical conditioning. It could happen on purpose. There's some pretty sad experiments that were done to poor little Albert, a literal toddler. People just were doing anything back in the day. So they kept giving this poor little boy a white rabbit, and then every time he had the white rabbit, they would like make a really loud clapping sound that would scare him, and then from then on, anytime he saw something white and fluffy, he started to cry. That's classical conditioning. One thing is associated with another. Operant conditioning, I think this is another thing that definitely existed before behaviorism, but I think once they started describing operant conditioning, it became way more systematized in institutions in America and around the world. So operant conditioning is just rewards and punishments. So you reward somebody you could do a negative reward or a positive reward. You can do a negative punishment or a positive punishment. So negative and positive are just referring to whether you want a behavior to increase or decrease. So a positive punishment might be, I'm going to take away your Xbox till you do your homework. So I'm punishing you by taking that away, and I want to increase the behavior of homework. So basically, all it is rewards and punishments to change behavior. And this has been instituted in schools, in family life, and in the workplace. So definitely influential through that. And that's not to say that these things didn't exist before, but I think the idea of them being this scientific thing that should be put into institutional practice became more systematic as behaviorism became more influential. And behaviorism was doing some other things, studying animal behavior, etc. They also just generally had a very... They basically thought everything was about learning. So everything is learned behavior. And so, again, there's no point in looking inside the brain. It's just if you teach somebody to do something the right way, they'll do it. And so they thought, for instance, that language was purely learned. And people came along to disagree with that, but I'll get to that in a second. So next we have humanism. So humanism was definitely kind of focused more in the area of counseling, same as psychoanalysis, but not just counseling. There was a whole journal of humanistic psychology, and if anybody here has heard of Abraham Maslow and the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's his thing. He was a humanist. So I would say that humanism was basically, generally had a positive view of people, wanted to find ways to help people have more fulfilling and better lives. And Maslow, for instance, was interested in the idea of peak experiences. So when do people feel like they've really self-actualized and fulfilled their highest potential? What are those experiences like? Let's describe them. And then Carl Rogers was a pretty influential humanist who worked as a therapist and talked about things like having unconditional positive regard for your clients, and definitely was very influential on therapy as we know it today, especially in changing therapy from being this thing where the client is told what to do. Carl Rogers called them clients rather than patients because he believed in empowering patients. So that's a kind of description of the different forces that were coming along. Humanism kind of started, I would say it was really gaining ground post-World War II. And as you can see here, the World Wars were influential on psychology. Carl Rogers was specifically working with veterans in the aftermath of the World Wars. So all these men are coming back home really, really, really traumatized. So it made people more aware we need to start developing better ways to help them. Also, just we need to understand people better. We need to understand what motivates people and why they act the way they do. Because really, really serious atrocities happened in both world wars. And getting news about genocide and mass murder and all sorts of horrible human experimentation drove more interest in psychology. But on the flip side, psychology was increasingly being seen as a potential tool of war. Now, this was always true. If you go back historically, people have always tried to manipulate their opponents and, do things like destroy the enemy's morale, etc. But they were getting more and more interested in extreme and systematic ways of manipulating the public, trying to find ways to program people. All of these things were being studied. So a lot of early computer science, now you might wonder, how does computer science tie into psychology? Well, we're going to get there in a second. A lot of early computer science and a lot of early psychology were being funded by the US government through the CIA, through the NIH. No, NIH is British. Why did I just say that? I'm thinking of the National Institute of Mental Health, NIM. A lot of early psychology research was being done through these institutions for the aim of quote-unquote national security. So yeah, we have the cognitive revolution. So again, the behaviorists were sitting there saying, you can't study the brain, you can't study what's going on cognitively, you should only study behavior. And people came along to say, we don't agree. So cognitive science, cognitive psychology is the study of mental processes, and it's kind of its own thing apart from the other forces we've talked about. They pretty definitively defeated behaviorism. That's not to say that behaviorism doesn't still have things in it worth studying and that it stopped existing because of cognitive psychology, but there was a lot of academic fighting going on at the time, and it's pretty well accepted that the cognitive science people won. So my cognitive psychology professor said that you should study, or part of cognitive science is studying the human brain like it's a computer. And actually, computers themselves were often designed off of the human brain. So that's just one way of thinking about it, kind of as a computational organ. And so a question in cognitive psychology is, what does the brain actually process? So what is it able to see or understand from the world around it? Two experiments I remember learning about in my cognitive psychology course were ones related to basically subliminal messaging. So they would do tests where they would just have somebody be doing something very not interesting, like reading or whatever, and they would flash millisecond long images. In one case they did a gun, and in that case they found that afterwards the people had higher levels of stress and adrenaline, and so they were more ready, they were more primed for violence or a fight. And then in other cases they did porn, and just those very subliminal subconscious messaging, they had elevated levels of arousal afterward. So people can process something on one level and not know about it. Another example would be micro expressions, which are basically there's supposed to be 7 of them that are universal, like disgust, fear, anger, surprise, a variety of different expressions that usually indicate that a person is trying not to show how they really feel, but that the expression comes on their face really fast. So there's evidence that people do pick up on these, even though they don't consciously remember seeing them. If you ever have this sense when you're talking to somebody, like, they seemed really chill, but somehow I thought they were anxious or angry or something, you might have seen a micro expression and not known it. And so cognitive psychology is also going to be studying what are the innate mental capacities of the brain, basically. So we have an ability to do math, right? So we don't have evidence, really. I mean, I could look into this more to be sure of this claim, but I'm pretty sure we don't have evidence of other animals doing high levels of math. So what is it in the brain that allows for this, right? And then same thing with language. We have this incredible language capability. Like, if you look at, for instance, other animals' communication, usually, not always, there's definitely exceptions to this, but usually they're communicating something pretty specific with pretty simple stimuli. So just a chirp might be a warning to another bird, something like that. Usually the sounds are kind of routine, versus with human language, it's basically has a unlimited capacity for complexity. So how did that happen? What is going on in the brain to facilitate this? And you can study that in terms of what we were talking about earlier with studying the brain, but you can also kind of study what are the structural elements of language. So linguistics is a huge overlap here. And then also, what are the limits of our ability mentally? So memory, a lot of this, it's a little bit hard for me to go over some of this because a lot of it does branch out beyond just one domain of psychology. Memory is going to be studied in a lot of different areas of psychology. But for instance, cognitive psychology studies working memory. So working memory is your most recent memories within the last 30 seconds or less. And so one early paper that was influential in cognitive science was one where they showed basically the magic number is 7 and you have plus or minus 2. So what that means, what that means here is, in your working memory, you can keep about 7 things in mind. And sometimes it's going to be less, it's going to be 5. Sometimes it's going to be more, it's going to be 9. But 7 is the average. So we have a limitation there. Our working memory can only hold so many things in mind at once. You can also study lots of other things about memory. You can study biases on memory. You can study the fact that our memory works better if we're in a certain mental state. So for instance, that's called state or mood dependent memory. So if you're depressed, you're more likely to remember other times you were depressed. If you're drinking alcohol, you're more likely to remember other times you were drinking alcohol. So yeah, basically these are the different things that cognitive science is looking at. I wouldn't necessarily say that all of the things I mentioned about memory are part of cognitive science, but I really wanted to mention that memory is a major thing studied in psychology. All right, I'm going to take a break because this has been a lot so far, but thank you guys, and I will be back in 1 second. Okay, thanks for bearing with me, and we are back. We're going to start now with specializations. So these are just different areas that you can focus in on if you're studying psychology. So I'm listing a whole lot here because there's a whole lot of them, and I'm not going to go in depth on these. Just wanted to give an idea of what goes on here with the different things you could potentially study that I find interesting. So we already talked about cognitive science. There's also the specialization to go into the career of experimental or research psychology. So obviously not everybody who studies psychology is doing the experiments. Some people specialize in that. Then we also have psychopathology, which is the study of things basically going wrong with people, like mental health wise, having problems and how to understand those problems and their causes. Things like that are covered under psychopathology. I think some people think that that's all psychology does, which is very unfortunate. Next, we have industrial organizational psychology. So this is applications to workplaces, to any organization, studying how psychology works in organizations, how to improve efficiency, things like that. Personality and individual differences. I really enjoyed this class when I took it because this is an area of psychology where they're not just focusing on trying to understand all people or general basic facts about psychology, but more looking at the fact that everybody is their own special individual. And this is where you get a lot of the personality tests coming out of this area, which are definitely often suspect, but that's not to say that all of them are useless. I think that the Ocean or Big Five personality test is kind of interesting and also has been very validated. So I wouldn't throw them all out. Then we have psychopharmacology. So this is the study of drugs and their effect on the brain and the body. So the psychology of drugs and how they affect people. Educational psychology. This is very studied in psychology. So learning, educational practices, things like that. Comparative psychology is an area I'm really interested in, which is the comparison of human psychology to other animals. And there's a lot of interesting things you can get out of that. Cross-cultural psychology, comparing the psychology of different cultures, how culture affects psychology, etc. Evolutionary psychology has a really bad rap because, a lot of people are really annoying about it, and then they're like, women be shopping because of hunter-gatherer times or whatever. It's often very silly and pseudoscientific. But I don't think that evolutionary psychology should be completely thrown out because we did evolve. So I think that there's ways that it can be applied, but I definitely wouldn't study it solely because it's too deterministic to say we do this because of evolution. And also a lot of people don't really seem to have a very good understanding of evolution in the first place, but that's a story for another day. Next, we have therapy and counseling. So this is another one that I think most people know about, but it's an area you can specialize in. So obviously you can do therapy, but you could also study therapy and the best therapeutic practices. Behavioral therapy, it's not necessarily behaviorism, but it could be applications towards behavior. This could even be things to do with drug counseling. And then there's also a whole area called behavioral biology where you're studying the biology that drives behavior. And I think maybe that sounds a little bit controversial, and I can understand why, but there just are some basic facts that you learn about if you study, childhood development or something like that. Because, for instance, we're born with reflexes. So a baby is born with the reflex to suck. So that means that it is biological. It's ingrained in us. There are things that are ingrained in us. Next, we have child psychology, which is another interesting area you can study. Then health psychology. What are the psychological factors that influence health? How does health influence psychology? So kind of going back and forth between those two things. And yeah, there's even more than that. There's sports psychology. You could go on and on with all the different ways you can apply psychology. So I wanted to do this basic intro to neuroscience. It's not really possible for me to even go over every term here in this picture because I just don't think we have the time, and I would start getting tired of defining terms and nobody would remember it anyway. But I did want to have this here for people to look at. So we're talking about localization. One of the aspects of course, you can go even deeper into localization because every single term here, there's like 500 more terms within each of these because there's special areas in each of them. It gets really, 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 really complicated. But we can still have this broad overview of, for instance, the lobes. So your brain has different lobes that do different things. I think at this point in the pop psychology world, most people know about frontal lobe, which is the part of your brain which is involved in executive function, decision making, often personality, motor control, but other parts of your brain also do those things. But it's definitely like the control center right there in the front of your brain. Then you also have the parietal lobe. So that one is going to be doing spatial processing for you and other things like that. You have the occipital lobe, which is your vision cortex generally. Then you also have your temporal lobe, which is generally doing auditory processing. It's also doing language processing for you, but it's also involved in emotion. So I think, again, you might hear, oh, this part of the brain does this, and then you just think, you could think, if you hear that, both no other part of the brain does that, but that's pretty much never true. And then you could also think, oh, that's the only thing it does, but that's also almost never true. The brain is very, very complex. So we went over the lobes real quick. I also wanted to mention from here the hippocampus. So people often know of the hippocampus as your memory center. Memory is also processed in a lot of different areas of the brain. But yes, hippocampus is heavily involved in memory. We also have amygdala. Amygdala can also be involved in memory. I would say your amygdala is your self-protective part of your brain. So what I mean by that is, we all know that the reason that we feel pain is to protect ourselves from damage. So if you burn yourself, you pull away from it. I think that your amygdala is kind of like that for the brain. So it's your, like, negative emotion center. It's handling your fear and your distress, stuff like that. So it's definitely implicated in a lot of mental health problems that people have. But if you understand that it's supposed to be there to protect you, I think it makes a little bit more sense. And it's also related to memories of fear. So that's why people have such strong anxiety instincts towards things that remind them of bad past situations. What else do I want to cover here? I think I want to also mention the corpus callosum. So you do have two different sides of your brain, left and right brain, and they are connected by the corpus callosum. I think it's actually callosum. Anyway. So there's crazy stories where people have their corpus callosum split. This used to be a practice people would do to treat epilepsy, and crazily enough, if you split somebody's brain, they actually seem to sort of end up being two people. I wouldn't necessarily say it's that simple, but actually one side of the brain cannot know what the other side is doing if this is cut. So very, very important part of the brain. I will also mention the thalamus and hypothalamus. So both of these parts of the brain are going to be involved in a lot of our daily life instincts. So for instance, they're going to be involved in signals to wake up, go to sleep, hunger, thirst, things like that. But they do slightly different things. The thalamus is the relay system for the brain. So like almost all sensory information is sent to the thalamus before it goes somewhere else. So if you're seeing something, it first goes to the thalamus and then to the occipital lobe. Whereas the hypothalamus is going to be handling a lot of things to do with the nervous system and the endocrine system. So that's just a basic overview of the brain. I could go into all of these other ones, but I think I'm just going to leave it there. We can only have so many terms in one day. So let's go to some more terms. Here on the other side, we're looking at bilateral versus lateral. So this is just, again, about, I don't know, these are terms used in anatomy pretty often, so you guys might be familiar with them. But basically, if something is bilateral, it's happening on both sides of the brain. And if it's lateral, it only happens on one side. I think another pop psychology thing people get into is left brain versus right brain. It's definitely a kind of simplistic understanding, but at the same time, there are things which are handled more on one side than the other. So language being more on the left side and spatial understanding being more on the right. But then actually more interesting to me here is contralateral versus ipsilateral. So this is one of those crazy things that's a fun fact that you will now know, and you might already know, but your left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and your right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. That's contralateral. And that's generally true of all motor control. I don't know why it happened that way, but it did. So I don't, again, it's just kind of a weird thing to think about. Like when I decide to move my right pinky, my left brain is deciding that or controlling that. And then if it's ipsilateral, it happens on the same side. So I think that a lot of I think that there's more variation in a lot of our sensory processing. Some of it is contralateral and some of it is ipsilateral. Okay, so the brain is very, very interconnected. I've been trying to emphasize that things don't normally just happen in one place, and that's because the whole brain is constantly communicating with itself. There are billions of neurons, they're firing off all the time, so there definitely are not like these separate atoms of the brain. The whole thing is one, even if there are different parts of it. Then I wanted to mention neuroplasticity. This is another term I think that has gotten increasingly into like common knowledge or common language, but it's basically the idea that the brain can adapt to things and do new things. So a really interesting example of this is if somebody goes blind, their occipital lobe doesn't just sit there doing nothing. It will be adapted to do other things. And this explains why people who have a sensory disability where they lose a sense often have sharper senses in other areas because that part of the brain can do other things. Then neurotransmitters. I put a question mark here because I wanted to point out to people that we don't necessarily know everything about neurotransmitters. That's another thing that's gotten very pop psychologized. So we've only even known about them for like 70, 80 years. And the idea, when you hear neurotransmitter, you think, oh, it's a thing in the brain. And then everybody's like, my dopamine levels, my serotonin levels, and they think of it purely in terms of the brain. But these neurotransmitters are throughout the whole nervous system. So, going down your spine, through all your different nerves, and also everywhere else. So your serotonin is in your blood, for instance. So they're very, very complex and important parts of the body, and I don't think that they're particularly perfectly understood, at least by like the layperson. Next we have somatic versus autonomic nervous system. So basically your somatic nervous system is the one that you control, and your autonomic nervous system is the one that is less in your control. So when I say less in your control, you can try to control your autonomic nervous system by doing things that are good for it, but you don't have control of it like I decide to blink my eyes. That's somatic versus autonomic. So the autonomic nervous system is going to be controlling your heart rate and things like that. Luckily, it's there to help you breathe when you're asleep, etc. And it's divided into sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Sympathetic is you're activating and you're getting going. So fear response could be involved in that. And then your parasympathetic is you're going to be your relax and stop doing things one, right? So just some helpful terms there. And I really want to emphasize the brain is extremely complex. So somebody's job could be to study one part of the thalamus, and that could be their whole research career. A small part of the thalamus, not the whole thalamus, one tiny component of the thalamus, because every single one of these things on the screen is even more complex than you see here. And then, of course, when you bring in the interconnectedness, it gets even more complicated. All right, sensation and perception. This is a fun one for me. So, a big part of psychology is studying the senses and how they work. So, sensation is when you have a physical stimuli, which your body picks up. So, I just touched my own knee. I felt that I touched my own knee. But perception is the process of taking that stimuli and then interpreting it and finding out what it is. So you can have a stimuli, like let's say I hit somebody in the head with a bat, and then they feel it and then they pass out. and then later I come back and I like poke them in the cheek to see if they're awake, they had a stimuli, right? Like, if they're not dead, their body still picked up the stimuli, but their brain is not awake to perceive it. That was a very violent example, but yeah. So that's sensation and perception. So first of all, I said here 5 senses ? Because we actually have way more than 5 senses. We learn about 5 senses in school, but there are more. And so first of all, we have interoception. So that is our ability to perceive things going on within our body. So for instance, we do have sensors around our heart, which tell us our heart rate. You can feel just a variety of different things going on with our internal organs. Not every single aspect of the body is easy to sense, but we have a lot more sensors within us than we know. We also have proprioception, which is the ability to tell where our body is. So if I am holding my hand up, I can feel that I'm holding my hand up. So that's another sense that we have there. I could keep going because there's just a lot of different ones, but I think I'm going to focus here on skin as an organ, a very complicated organ. I already mentioned the galvanic skin response earlier. Well, we also have lots of other things going on. It's not just touch, because your skin can perceive all different kinds of things. So for instance, temperature, moisture. Moisture is kind of a weird case, but that's another one. And pressure. We actually have 2 different pathways, 2 different kinds of sensors, one which picks up light pressure and another one that picks up deep pressure, right? So lots of complexity going on there. Smell is very unique. So I mentioned earlier that the thalamus is the thing that processes most sensory information. The exception to that is smell. Smell goes straight to the olfactory bulb, or bulbs, because there's more than one, in the brain. So that's why smell is often very, very direct and kind of deeper. So they've done studies, for instance, showing that familiar sights often bring people back to their teenage years, but smells bring people back to their earliest memories. And they think that might be because smell is the most direct of all the senses, straight to the processing unit. Pheromones is another thing that I think people don't really consider as part of our sensory world, because I think it's a mixture of we're not usually consciously aware of them and we don't like to think of ourselves as having pheromones, but we do. Our nose can pick up on other people's pheromones, and that plays a big role in attraction. Habituation is just the term for when you get used to a stimuli. So when you first come in a room, you hear the annoying creaking sound in the background or whatever, and then once you're in there for 30 minutes, you don't really notice it anymore. That is habituation. Attention is often studied in sensation and perception. I'm trying to remember if I had a specific point I wanted to make about that. Basically, you can just study how people's attention works. So, for instance, I remember one study that I saw where they were having people watch a video of a basketball game, and they were having people count how many baskets were made, and they introduced a bunch of different balls. So 10 different balls are being bounced around all the time. So they're concentrating so hard on counting. And then when they were at the end, they were asked, did you see anything special about this video? And they were like, no. And then it turned out that during the video, a person in a gorilla suit just walked through the court, and they didn't notice it because of selective attention, which isn't necessarily studied in sensation and perception, but I felt like there was kind of overlap there. The gate control theory of pain is basically the idea. Another thing that is unique in your sensory processing is that pain has its own pathway. So all of the other senses go through the same pathway to get to your brain, whereas pain has its own unique pathway. So they think that potentially this is why, if I'm having a really bad pain in my foot right now, and instead of focusing on that pain, I put a lot of pressure on my leg, I will feel that pressure and it will block out the pain. That's the gate control theory of pain, because they think that having senses or sensory information coming from another of the pathways would block the pain pathway, basically. Absolute threshold and Weber's law are interrelated. Hold on, let me get a sip of water here. So your absolute threshold has to do with basically the smallest amount of a stimuli that can be perceived. So like the faintest amount of light, right? These are the things that can kind of be studied a little bit more concretely in psychology. Actually, a little bit less of social science and a little more of like biological science here. And then Weber's law, it's probably Weber's law, has to do with the just recognizable difference. So like how much of a difference of a stimuli can you notice? So for instance, if I'm driving in the car and I've got my volume at 20 listening to music, and then I turn it up 2 points, I might not notice that difference. So Weber's law has to do with the intensity of the original stimulus. So maybe if I have the music on really, really quiet and I turn it up just 2 notches, I'll notice the difference. Versus if it's already really loud, I might not notice the difference. I wanted to point out this concept of sensory integration because I found it very interesting over time. So when we're born, we don't know what any of this stuff is, right? Like you start seeing and you're like, what is that? I ain't never done that before. You start feeling and you're like, what is touching me? I don't like this. Like hearing, and you don't know what anything means. So when you first come into the world, you have sensation but no perception. So you have to learn how to do that. And one crazy fact is we see everything upside down. So when you're first born, it would be even harder to learn what you're seeing. And then your brain has to learn to turn everything the other way. So it takes a long time to do this. This is primarily what babies are doing for the first years of their life, along with learning how to control their motor functions. Finally, I wanted to mention hallucination, because this is another thing that really interested me when I was taking neuroscience and sensation and perception. I started to kind of ask myself, hey, so if you have perception but there was no sensation, is that a hallucination? And it turns out it is. So that's not to say that that automatically means it's psychopathological, like there's something wrong. Actually, if you look it up, like almost everybody, over the course of their lifetime will hallucinate. So the most common are actually tactile hallucinations, feeling like something is touching you when it's not. So like let's say you're sitting in grass, you start feeling like bugs are crawling on you, but then you don't find any bugs. Or you feel like hair is touching your face and there's no hair. Those would be tactile hallucinations. People often think they see something out of the corner of their eye or hear something and there's nothing there. These are actually pretty common and staple things in human psychology. It's not necessarily a sign of anything being wrong. It just happens because those parts of your brain can just fire for no apparent reason. Okay, Gestalt. So I mentioned this earlier. Gestalt psychology is often studying sensation and perception, and specifically, how do we understand information presented to us in the world? So these are examples of Gestalt psychology for vision. So basically, how do you perceive the visual information that comes to you? What are the principles, and how can we describe them? So I don't want to go through each of these necessarily just for like time's sake, but I wanted to point out this one here, proximity. When you think about it, just totally without your normal way of thinking, all we have here is a bunch of squares. There is no L. Because the squares aren't even touching each other, but our brain is wired to see the fact that some of them are lighter and some of them are darker and group them together, right? And similarity, we group things that are similar together. Just things like that. So just wanted to include this as kind of another example for people here to kind of see some of the more, these are kind of considered like laws in psychology because they're very testable and very like universal, basically, for understanding of how human sensation and perception works. Okay, so another domain of psychology would be developmental psychology. Let me see, how do I go about this? Let's start with nature versus nurture. So the nature versus nurture question is definitely one that psychology is going to deal with, and I would say developmental psychology would be the primary area where this would be kind of considered. The more you understand about psychology and biology, the less you're going to see this as a binary or a versus situation, because there is no nurture without nature, or like you are a biological organism and then you interact with an environment, and that environment, you would not exist as an individual without that environment, basically. So it gets really, really complicated, but you can do all kinds of different studies and ways of looking at this topic. So for instance, within developmental psychology, there have been a lot of twin studies where like twins were separated at birth. They have been questioned scientifically for what they actually say about anything, but that's one way that people have tried to study this question. Also, genetics and epigenetics can be studied. So obviously we have genetics, and then on top of that, our genes can change in expression due to environment. So very, very complex back and forth relationship between these things. Kind of already said this with Freud, but yeah, the importance of parent and child relationships and earliest years are often studied in developmental psychology. So just really a lot of implications for parenting here, especially things like breastfeeding being important for the development of a child, kangaroo care, where a mother will hold the baby to her chest, being important and really meaningful, like for the baby's development. I think that for a lot of my early life, I had the impression that, like, I think a lot of people seem to have this impression, oh, you don't remember your earliest years, so they're not important. But all of the research says otherwise, that those earliest years are very significant in terms of how the child is treated, how it interacts with the world around it, and the kind of nutrition and things like that the child will get. So then we have a variety of different theories about development. So obviously you're going to study physical development stages, psychosexual stages. So that would be Freud's good old theory here we have on the screen. So I mentioned earlier that Freudian psychology is often very physical and embodied. So you can see here Freud is first thinking that, like, kind of trying to go back to the earliest years, and it makes more sense if you work with very young children why he put things this way. The first battle you go through in life is kind of one of helplessness, right? Because as a baby, you have to rely entirely on those around you to take care of you, and the main thing you're concerned with is taking in. So you're trying to make sure you get enough of the milk to survive. And so Freud thought that this was all tied up in later problems. You know, if you've ever heard oral fixation, that's related to Freud's idea that if something goes wrong during this phase, you could end up with an oral fixation. That doesn't just mean that you like to like chew on something or suck on something. It could also mean you try to solve your problems by taking in substances, right? So little fun Freudian psychology for y'all. And then the next thing that happens, significant thing that happens in your development, at least in Freud's view, is like potty training. So you go from everything is taken care of for me to now demands are being put on me and I'm being told I have to do this or that. So if you've heard of like somebody having an anal personality, it's kind of this idea that like if potty training goes wrong, then the person is just like really repressed and concerned about how they're seen or things like that. I could go into this more, but I'm going to try not to spend too much time on it. So next we have the phallic stage, which is when young children start to realize gender differences and things like that. So I don't really like some of Freud's thoughts about this, but that was what he thought. Then we have a latent stage, which is kind of a stage where people are not as driven by hold on a sec. I'll get to that in a second. People are not as driven by erotic drives, basically. And then finally you enter the genital stage successfully in a normally developing child in Freud's view. But then outside of the psychosexual stages, we also have sensory motor. So I already mentioned the need to integrate senses and learn how to move. But also within that, the development of cognition. So the mind going from less complex thinking to more complex thinking to gaining the ability to do abstract thought or think about thinking. And also through this development, there is an important stage of developing theory of mind, which is basically the ability to perspective take and to understand that other people don't have your brain, basically. So other people don't know what you know, things like that. And then psychosocial stages came up with by a guy named Erik Erikson, and he actually is one of the developmental psychologists who went through the entire lifespan. So from being a baby all the way to old age, when a lot of other people focus only on childhood. And kind of interesting if you feel like looking into it, but I'm not going to go into it just because time reasons. Then finally we have moral development. So this fella named Kohlberg came up with this idea that we start with basically being motivated by wanting to avoid punishment or self-interest. That's the origin of moral development in children. And then next we get into more of a wanting to look good place, or a very rigid moral thinking where we're just concerned with law and order. And then the final two stages would be social contract, so wanting to do good because that's for the good of all. And then finally, having morals based on principles. But then this lady Gilligan criticized this model for being sexist because she thought it didn't really include a female moral development. So she kind of developed an idea of a morality of care, which is basically like women are taught to prioritize others first and take care of others. So then they have to go through a moral development where they do that, and then they have to kind of negotiate their own needs with the demands being put on them. All right, hold on a second. I'm going to read the message here in the chat. It says, "It's really interesting what you mentioned about smell, because in our evolutionary history, some of our early primate ancestors had a much more powerful sense of smell. I don't know that I can say this. Rhinariums allow organisms to gain more information from smelling things. It's still the main way that a lot of species navigate the world. We know from fossil evidence that our ancestors had complex noses with several chambers dedicated to processing different inputs from a scent. Maybe the directness of sensory input is some kind of holdover from that." Yeah, probably. I also think that we could have stronger senses of smell if we focused on it more. And I sort of have a sense that humans have tried to move away from having a strong sense of smell because we associate that with animals. But that's just my pet theory. Okay. All right, so I got this slide here on psychoanalysis. I actually didn't originally include this, but I ran it by somebody else who said I needed to include it, so now we have modern psychoanalysis slide. I think I already mentioned psychic drives because I ended up bringing that up with Freud, but other people have kind of developed their own ideas about what drives people. Not everybody agreed with Freud, particularly in terms of kind of boiling everything down to sex, which to some degree Freud did. Other psychoanalysts have not done so. This is a term from Freudian psychology, which I think is interesting: repetition compulsion. So this is basically the idea that sorry, there was another message in the chat. All right, I'm focusing. The idea that when you experience a traumatic event, you're compelled to repeat it and reenact it, basically. Another concept that comes out of psychoanalysis is attachment theory. That's not to say attachment theory is exclusive to psychoanalysis, but it was developed by people who were trained in psychoanalysis. So even people who maybe aren't known as psychoanalysts have been very influenced by psychoanalysis, so it's kind of a broad umbrella type thing. So attachment theory is just the idea that the way that children experience things in early childhood, like let's say that they have a mother who's really busy all the time, and the mom really cares about the baby and wants to be there, but she just can't be there much. That child could end up having what's called in attachment theory an anxious attachment. I think this is one of those things that's really become kind of common in pop psychology, but yeah, it is interesting or worth studying. Next we have object relations theory. So this is kind of a more high concept thing that would take a while to really learn about, but basically it's the idea of studying things in terms of self and other. So when we first come into the world, we're learning the boundaries of our self through the sensory integration, through our ability to start learning how to do stuff and move things around. We start to realize, I'm this. I experience these things, I can do these things, and other people call me by a name, and that means I'm a person who fits into this unit. And then you are encountering the other all the time. And the most important original other is the mother, because you literally come out of her body and then relate to her and need her. So then they start to object relations theory starts to develop ideas about relating to others. So I could try to make an other a part of me, or I could try to eliminate the other because it threatens myself. These are very basic descriptions, but if you want to look more into it, I do recommend trying to learn more about object relations theory, because I think there's a lot of applications. Definitely ideas about like splitting and things like that fall under this. Inferiority and superiority complexes and the like have been studied in psychoanalysis. With object relations theory, that would mainly be with Melanie Klein, and then, oh my gosh, am I messing that up? I'm pretty sure I'm right. And then inferiority and superiority would be from Alfred Adler. And then also people have gone on to develop a female perspective on psychosexual development. So obviously, like, Freud was kind of sexist, or, unfortunately very male-centered. He kind of prioritized the male experience and the phallus as being extremely important. So other psychoanalysts have come along to do a more female-centered approach, which is cool. And then, yeah. Okay. So, and like for instance, Karen Horney would be a person who did that, and she would, like, it's kind of to me it's a little bit silly, but it's like, Freud said there's penis envy, well, maybe men have womb envy, that type of thing. Okay, so this is my favorite branch of psychology. I'm gonna get a sip of water because my voice is struggling a little bit here. Unfortunately, this is the first day of the year I've had allergies. My throat was hurting earlier, and I was like, great. Okay. Social psychology, my favorite branch. This was my favorite thing to study. I really enjoyed the class. So, some of the earliest social psychology experiments were just about social facilitation, and this is the most basic concept. They literally just had people do bike races, and they found that people biked faster when they were biking against someone else. So, competition. Another early study, and I don't think I actually ever learned about this in social psychology, but when I thought about it, I really wanted to include this. These were studies done in the 1940s, which found that when little children, and this is like age 4 to 7, were given dolls, they did this with African American and white children and black and white dolls, and they found that the white children preferred white dolls, but so did the black children. The black children far preferred the white dolls, which is quite sad. And they did a variety of different tests. They asked them all kinds of questions about the dolls. Is the doll good? Is the doll beautiful? And the poor children, the black children, when they were asked which doll looks like you, after having usually answered that the doll was not good and they didn't want to play with it, it caused them quite a bit of distress when they were asked which one looks like you. So that's an early social psychology experiment. Of course, that's, in a very racist context when these were done, and that was later used to, like, show how serious racism in the US was. Asch experiments, these are conformity experiments. So conformity is a major thing studied in social psychology. They would do things like bring people into a room and tell them to pick which one of like 3 lines, A, B, or C, is the longest. And there would be a clear winner. B would clearly be the longest one. But then they would have a bunch of Confederates in the study. So Confederate in social science research means somebody who's in on it. So they're helping you do the study. So all the Confederates would pick A, even though the clear option is B. And then the poor schmuck who doesn't know what's happening would also pick A and completely ignore their own eyes because everybody else in the room picked something else. So they would conform to what it seems like everybody else's opinion was. And there's been lots of different studies on this topic. People generally conform. And yeah, let's see. So next we have the Stanford Prison Experiment. This is like very commonly known. It's this idea that, like, in Stanford, they did a study where they brought a bunch of people in, and then they told some of them that they were prison guards and others that they were prisoners. And then, of course, the guards went crazy with power, yada, yada, yada. Well, at this point, we have reason to believe that this study was, like, faked. And the person who ran it really wanted a particular result. So that one's pretty much thrown out. If you hear anybody referencing it, you don't need to take them seriously. But the Milgram experiments have been extensively validated. They have been replicated many times and are definitely important social science research. So this is one of the ones that was done because of World War II, because of the trials that were going on. These were carried out in the 60s during a time when Nazi war criminals were being tried. So Milgram comes along. It might actually have been the 50s, but I think it was the 60s. Anyway, Milgram comes along and he's like, I want to research this. I want to research obedience, right? So what they would do is they would get people in for the experiment, and then they would have a Confederate in another room. So this person is, again, in on the experiment, and then they would have the quote-unquote, like, researcher or whoever in the room. And then they would tell the real test subject to do shocks, to shock the person in the other room, and see how far they could get the person to go with the shocks. So the Confederate would be in the other room moaning, crying, saying, I don't want to do this anymore, it hurts so bad. And they would see how far they could go. And in many of the experiments, like 60% or more would go all the way to the point of killing someone else just because they were told to. And they've done this with a variety of different populations. So they've found different people to experiment on. They've done variations where on the one hand, they can hear the other person and see them suffering, but on the other, what if you don't even see them? People are way more likely to go all the way to killing somebody if they don't even see them when they're administering the shocks. And then they'd also do variations on it where, like, they'd have the quote-unquote researcher telling them to administer the shocks. They'd have them in, like, a white coat, and they'd hold the experiment in, like, a really fancy-looking lab. Just those things which signal authority made people even more obedient, right? So I could talk more about the different kind of politics of these experiments and whatever, but they've been repeated and validated so many times that there's definitely something to them, and I think it's kind of scary. The Good Samaritan study was one that I found kind of interesting. It's another one there where they're fooling and tricking people, because the social psychologists love to do that. They would have people, they would tell them something like, we really love your work, and you're just so great at what you do. We really want to get you to give us a speech. You got to go over to this area over here so you can give your speech. And then they'd be, like, walking along the way, and then somebody would be lying on the ground. Again, they're in on the experiment, and they'd be like, I need help, I'm dying. And then they'd see, does the person stop to help? And they found that the major factor which controlled whether they'd stop to help was time pressure. If somebody was in a hurry, they would not stop. And they also found no effect of the person's stated beliefs. So if the person said, I'm a Christian, I believe in helping others, made no difference for the results of the study. Next, we have the Bandura Bobo doll. So this is about social learning. They would bring little children into a room, and then they'd have an adult in the room, and the adult would start to beat up a doll, right? Or alternately, be really nice to the doll. And then the children would just see this modeled, and then they would replicate the behavior. So if the adult was really nice, they would be nice to the doll. If the adult beat up the doll, they would beat up the doll. So very monkey see, monkey do type thing, but social learning is a major factor in social psychology. This is another area where I could talk more about some of the different implications of the study, but I think I will leave it there for time reasons. Influence and liking are studied in psychology. So literally, there's a book called How to Win Friends and Influence People. A lot of those techniques are studied in social psychology. On the one hand, you can just, study these things just for just studying them, but a lot of people study how to influence others for sales purposes. A lot of these techniques are used in sales. So just something like foot in the door. So if you can get somebody to agree to a little thing, they're more likely to agree to a bigger thing, stuff like that. So on the one hand, obviously, they can be used for nefarious reasons, but if you want to understand the psychology of, manipulative salespeople, then you can look into that more. Implicit association is studied in psychology, so this is the idea that, it basically is, implicit racism, right? So you can study, do people make racist associations? Are they more likely to be scared of black people? There's a test for this, which they're going to make you take in any social psychology course. I had to take the test, and then I had to write a paper on it. Okay. Next, we have cognitive dissonance being studied in social psychology. This term was coined by a social psychologist who had studied people in a doomsday cult and how they dealt with that when there was no doomsday. They had predicted the world was gonna end one day, and then it did not end. So basically, cognitive dissonance, I think probably most people have heard the term, but it's studying how do people deal with conflicts internally. So if they believe one thing and then the world is a different way, how are they going to deal with the discomfort that comes with that? The bystander effect is studied in social psychology. Why do people just stand there and do nothing if something bad is happening? Diffusion of responsibility is a big term here. So when people are in a big crowd, they're less likely to offer help than if they're the only person there. And then we have biases and errors in psychology. So the fundamental and ultimate attribution errors. Now can I get this right? I think the fundamental attribution error is when you look at somebody else and you're like, their behavior is just because of who they are. So for instance, somebody cuts me off in traffic. I'm like, what a jerk. How could you do this to me? Meh. But if I do something like that, I'm like, well, I have a good reason for it though. So you're more likely to give yourself a break versus other people. With other people, you think that's just who they are. And then, and not consider, the factors. And then the ultimate attribution error is about in-group versus out-group. So it's basically the same thing, except it has to do with what group that person belongs to. So I'll do another driving example. Growing up, people always said Asians are bad drivers. So if you see a bad driver who's Asian, you're like, oh, it's because they're Asian. Versus if I see somebody else who's a bad driver, I'm just like, oh, they're a bad driver. And then you can also do that with your in-group. I guess I'll talk about that a little more in a second. Another thing I thought was interesting that I learned about in social psychology was the just world fallacy. So it's kind of actually related to cognitive dissonance as well, because it's let's say you believe that the world is fair, then how do you interpret the world based on that? So if somebody fails at something, or they're poor or whatever, that's just because they failed and they're not good at it. they didn't work hard enough or whatever. And then if somebody's successful, that means they deserve it. That would be the just world fallacy, because it's like a belief that the world is ultimately fair. Hindsight bias, I feel like makes sense. Like, you didn't really know something at the time, but then when you find out information later, you're like, I knew that the whole time. Confirmation bias, it just makes sense. People like to believe things that make sense to them, that they already believe. They like information which kind of makes them feel better about themselves. They're more likely to believe something that already fits with what they believe, etc. So that's confirmation bias. And then burging and corfing, very pleasant words there. Burging means basking in reflected glory. So kind of related to the attribution error I talked about earlier. It's like I want to associate myself with a group and then take credit for that group's accomplishments, right? So I feel better about myself when my sports team wins. And then casting off reflected failure is the opposite. It's like, oh, that group's not doing so hot. I don't want to be associated with them. Okay. All right, that's social psychology. Yay. Okay. We're nearing the home stretch here. Okay. We're going to talk about research and evidence. These are very important things to talk about. Anybody who undergoes to take psychology is going to need to study research methods and statistics. We're going to talk more about the research methods. So variables and hypotheses. I feel like hopefully this makes sense to people, right? So a variable is what you're trying to study. You have the independent variable, which is like what you're controlling, and statistics. And then you have the dependent variable, which is what you're trying to measure, right? And then hypotheses should hopefully make sense. But I wanted to mention with this the difficulty of coming up with an operational definition for a variable. So what I mean by that is, let's say I want to study microexpressions, like I talked about earlier. And then that might be easy to do, because I could maybe take a video of that person's face and then see it. But how do I actually measure the response to that? Right? And how do you know if you're actually measuring what you're trying to measure? These are the really difficult things to handle in the social sciences. And there's a lot that goes into it. I don't know how much time I want to spend on it, but basically you have to be aware of this if you're trying to understand social science research and know how good social science research is. In a lot of cases, there are already measures which exist, which are supposed to measure something. But even then, how do you know for sure you're getting a valid measurement? So that's an important point. And then sample versus population. So let's say I'm trying to study American high school students. Well, I almost certainly can't poll like every American high school student. I don't have access to them. So I need to do a sample of this population and just study some of them. But then you need to be getting a representative sample, a sample that actually represents that population. And you also need to have like a good method so that you know you're actually doing that. Often samples are taken randomly. So if you hear that, like randomized sample, it just means they didn't like go with convenience is another type of sampling. Like, I just went to the closest high schools to me. Well, cool, but is that representative of the entire US if that's supposed to be your population? So you could get a list of every single high school in the United States and then have a program pick 10 for you at random or something, right? Then research can be experimental or non-experimental, and this basically has to do with the level of control and your ability to claim causality. So in an experiment, you can usually claim some kind of causal link because you have controlled the variables enough to be able to say that. So like I'll give a basic example from like biology. I'm trying to see if fertilizer makes something grow faster. So I have a control group that doesn't get fertilized, and then I have a group that gets fertilized. Then I find that the group which has been fertilized grows better and grows higher. I can make a causal link between fertilizer and growth. But if I didn't control that way, and I only had just like a field that had been fertilized that I measured, I could try to make a claim that like, oh, fertilizer relates to growth, but I can't make a strong causal claim. So non-experimental research would be correlational research. You may have heard correlation is not causation, right? That doesn't mean that correlational research isn't useful, but you can't make a causal claim. Also, observational research would be non-experimental. A variety of others would be non-experimental. You can do qualitative research where you just collect, like interviews, for instance. But quantitative is you can turn it into numbers. So you can do a survey where you ask people questions and then you have them answer 1 to 5. That would be quantitative research. You can do research in the field, or you can do research in a lab. You have to consider, if you're doing research in a lab, that that's not a naturalistic setting, right? So just the fact that you're doing it in a lab, you don't know for sure that's how people would behave normally. But if you do work in a field, you can't control that much if you just go out into the world to do research. So and even in the field, like let's say you go to a workplace, if people there know that you're there, you could be influencing them. And this has been long studied in the social sciences, and it is a major problem that they have to deal with. Ethnography is a crossover with anthropology, kind of a non-experimental research design where you just kind of go in and see what's going on in an area and kind of observe, take notes, do interviews. We have longitudinal versus short-term research. So some studies are going to be a single day and some will go over decades. Not saying that short-term is bad, just you have to take that into consideration when you're looking at a research study. Double-blind is when research is done where they tell they don't tell anybody involved which group somebody's assigned to, for instance. So if I have 2 groups, I have a control group and an experimental group, I'm the researcher, I don't even know which group the person is in, much less that the subject, right? So nobody involved in doing the research, the subjects or the researcher, know which group they're in, which prevents biases because, bias can occur. So that's why double-blind is used. Self-report research is when you just kind of ask somebody to tell you what they think about something. On the one hand, that's useful. You want that kind of data. But on the other, you don't know for sure how much you can kind of trust people's self-report. So it's kind of limited. You also have effects that occur in research. So kind of, I already mentioned, but people's desire to see a result could influence the results. But also we have effects like fatigue, like the fatigue I'm currently feeling from doing this lecture, and also practice effects. So what that means is, let's say you give somebody an 100-question survey. By question 50, they're going to be tired, and they might not even really want to do it anymore. They're not putting as much thought into their answers. They're just kind of answering randomly. You also have the practice effect where, let's say you're trying to study mental capacity and its development. So you give a group of 5th graders a test 1 year. Then the next year you gave them the same test and you're like, whoa, look, they did so much better this year. They've gotten so much smarter. Well, that could just be a practice effect because they took it last year, right? So they remember it. So then when people are trying to deal with these type of effects, they may use counterbalancing. So for instance, with the 100-question test that I mentioned, you could split the test in half, and then half of your participants start with the second half, and the other half start with the first half, if that makes sense, to counterbalance and get rid of the fatigue effect. Finally, you might use your peers or experts to help you validate what you're doing. So I mentioned earlier the difficulty of coming up with variable definitions and coming up with measurements. So you have to create, let's say I want to do a study and there's no existing survey. Often in social science research, people just use already existing measures because they're often very well validated. But if none exist, you might have to make up your own. So you need to use your peers or experts to help you do that. So these are just kind of the things that you have to think about to be a good social scientist. And there's even more, trust me. I mean, I took a whole class on just that. So, okay. So how do you assess evidence? Obviously, you're going to want to look for things that are peer-reviewed. But peer review doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean everything, because I've seen a lot of bad peer-reviewed research. So currency is just like, how recent is it? I wouldn't not look at old research, but this is especially important for like really quickly developing fields. And also sometimes you might want to look at old research just to see what people were saying back in the day, you know? Science kind of goes through its own cycles and fads, so sometimes things have kind of gone by the wayside that maybe shouldn't have. So I already mentioned correlation is not causation. Statistical power. This is just important to keep in mind because it basically has to do with where, how confident can you be that you've actually found significant results, right? So where the statistical power is set determines whether or not you end up saying my results were significant. So for instance, you might read a paper that says, we found an effect, but it was not significant. That means that it didn't meet their statistical power requirement, basically. Or honestly, I don't think I said that the right way, but anyway. But also just keep in mind that the researchers can kind of decide where to set that. So, they could say we found significant results, and then you look at it and it's like, well, that wasn't a very hard bar to clear in this case, but they're supposed to explain why they set the statistical power where they did. Then we have validity and reliability. So for research to be valid, like a research design, that's basically a measure of how much it actually measures your variable, right? So we already said this. So for instance, let's take like a common measurement for depression. It would be well validated if they've found over time that when it says somebody's depressed, it turns out that person is actually depressed. Versus it would not be a valid measure if half the time the person isn't even really depressed and it just says everyone's depressed, right? Then reliability means, is something reliable over different uses? So like, if it's supposed to, like, let's say there's a design and it's supposed to measure one very specific thing that shouldn't change that much, but then you give it to like people twice and they get completely different results each time, that would be like a red flag for reliability. Within social science and just science in general, we've got a problem of I want to say reproducibility, replicatability, and so the problem of this is, for science to work, you're supposed to be able to find the same result every time, right? Or you're supposed to be able to, like, basically the reason that research papers are written with all of that detail about how they did it is so people can replicate it to see if they get the same result, right? But unfortunately, a lot of the most interesting and cool findings that seem to come out in the social sciences often are not replicated. So that's kind of a little embarrassing for the field to deal with. Although I would say this is also true outside of social science. But anyway, we also have just issues of academia. So there's a lot of pressure to publish. There's a lot of pressure to have a big fancy career. People want to be producing interesting studies, and they might unconsciously or consciously kind of manipulate things to get that for themselves. So that's important to keep in mind. We also have the issue of funding and conflicts of interest. So a lot of the funding for psychology research is coming from pharmaceutical companies. Also, a lot comes from the government, so you just have to keep that in mind. Who is paying for this, and does that bias the research? I already mentioned some of the biases. I think I mentioned demand effects earlier too. That's just like let's say that you come into a research study and you kind of like the researcher. He seems like a nice guy. And then you're like, it seems to me like he's trying to study this. I wouldn't really mind if he found that result. So like just the relationship between the subjects and the researcher, and the subjects kind of wanting to like please the researcher, could bias the results. File drawer problem is a problem in science in general. People don't want to publish non-significant results. So they want to publish something that sounds interesting and cool, like they found something. They don't want to publish something where they're like, we thought we were going to find something and then we didn't. So they just kind of like put that study away in a file drawer, and then nobody finds out about it. And it's like, we should also know about non-significant results. Just to like not waste people's time researching something. Like how many like hundreds of studies have been done that no one even knows about? They just threw the money out the window. Pop psychology I've been mentioning a lot. It's a problem. I think that people want to feel like experts. They want to feel like they know something about themselves. Some people are trying to sell stuff. People like to feel like they totally understand other people, so they're like, oh, I get you, you're a narcissist, and now I'm morally superior to you, or whatever. A lot of that going on. Also just publishing, like journalism and science writing is often really bad. They want to have like a catchy headline. They water everything down. I've had several times where I was reading an article and they made these claims and then they cited research, and then I went and read the research and it did not say what that article claimed. It's quite disturbing. We also have the weird problem. Weird stands for something. I'm not going to be able to remember it perfectly, but basically it's the problem of so much psychology research being done in the first world on wealthier people, on white people, all that type of stuff. There's also just an issue of so much research is done on college students because they're the ones who are accessible to professors. Finally, a more positive thing to mention here is meta-analysis. So I think that generally meta-analysis is more trustworthy. It's basically a kind of research that is like meta research. They will study hundreds, if not thousands, of other studies that have already been done. When they do that, they have more of an ability to say firmly that there has been like a scientific discovery. Like if 500 papers say something, it feels more like, okay, we can actually say with confidence that this is a thing. Also, just kind of bringing together a lot of different knowledge into one place. So I think meta-analysis is very useful and very trustworthy comparatively. Okay, so reading academic psychology. I think a lot of people are intimidated by academic writing, but it's not as difficult as you might think, or some of them might be more difficult. If you're not specialized in an area, you might not be able to tell anything, but you can at least read an introduction. You can at least scan the methods and results, and then you can read the discussion and conclusions, because generally those should all be written in more plain language. For methods, I think it can be difficult if you don't know anything about the area to understand what they're talking about, but you would be surprised how I think even a lay person could poke holes in some of these studies that are out there. I was actually looking up for this, trying to find some examples for you guys of like how to assess the quality of an academic paper, and I found somebody who did this write-up. It was actually published in an academic journal, and one of their questions to ask was the inclusion method for the sample population included? Like, did they explain how they got their sample? That should be the most obvious thing that should be included, but people are out here not doing it, right? So I think if you're able to just take a look at it and just ask yourself, does it seem like what they're saying they did would actually have the implications they say it does? Does it seem like what they, like their method would actually measure what they're saying they measured? You would be surprised. You can figure things out a little bit better than you think you could a lot of the time. There's definitely difficult things out there, but also some academic psychology is gonna be less experimental and more sort of straying into the humanities or more qualitative, so it should be a lot easier to read. But definitely, if you look at a methods section and it's like a paragraph, that's a red flag unless it's like the simplest study of all time. So just some basic ideas of how to start looking at academic psychology. And we're finally closing. Okay, so I wanted to just end on giving some food for thought for future studies into psychology. So psychology has limitations. You can really only study so much. So I remember being in neuroscience, and we were talking about stuff about sensation and perception. I think we were actually talking about visual processing. And I just had this very strange sense all of a sudden. It was kind of a weird sense of like unreality. And I just raised my hand and I was like, okay, we're studying like the physical process of how this works, but what am I actually seeing? Like, how do you cross over from things like your brain sends signals and then your like occipital lobe makes a map out of them? Well, I feel like I don't see a map. I feel like I see and I experience this world around me, and it doesn't feel like there's any connection between that and what I'm studying here. And my professor was like, we can't study what you're talking about. We can't study experience. And I was like, oh, okay, all right. So we can study a lot, but at the end of the day, it's kind of like knowledge that we pick up from, you know, the kind of research we're talking about. I think that psychology can also be a philosophy, though, and that there is value in introspection. These things are not really foregrounded in academic psychology because it wants to be seen as a science. But I think that it's just factual that there's things that scientific psychology can't do. So I don't think that we should throw out the idea of it being a philosophy or being something that you can introspect and learn about yourself through. I think that it's actually really worth pursuing that as much as possible. But studying all the different stuff that I've talked about so far will help you do better introspection, in my opinion. I mentioned this briefly when I was talking about the influence of the world wars, but there's a lot of sinister elements of psychology. There's a lot of overlap with psychological warfare and things like that, and manipulation, advertising. If you don't study psychology, you better believe that your psychology is being studied by the data people, by the advertisers, by the government. Other people are very invested in psychology. So I think it's worth studying for basically like defending yourself from this stuff. So the next steps I would say would be to just learn as much as you can. And I wouldn't focus solely on psychology. Psychology is also limited because it tends to focus not necessarily on the individual, but like on just the human organism. It doesn't often pay as much attention to society, institutions, structures. You need to go to sociology for that. You need to go to anthropology for culture. Biology is also important. Like, you have to do all of these different things in tandem. And then just like follow what interests you. Like, whatever was most interesting to you from this lecture, that can be where you go next. But yeah, thank you guys so much for joining. I had a great time, and my voice is a little bit shot, but it was fun.